Imagine you're in a supermarket, shopping for wine. You pick up a bottle and you turn it over and it says, made in Japan. Do you take it home curious to try it out, or do you put it back on the shelf because it's not from your favorite vineyard? Or is none of this relevant because wine is wine and it's been a long week? Well, Japan does make wine, and although it's relatively new to the industry, it's worth trying. But Japan's climate is completely different to most traditional winemaking countries because it's really hot and humid here. So that means that they need to use specific grapes to go with the climate, and then maybe use some other techniques to get the best out of those grapes. So we'll go to a winery called Tsukuba Winery and see how they do things and whether it's any different to what you might expect. I can already tell you though that Japan's wine is different, or at least some of them are, because this red is supposedly unlike any other red that I've had before. But we'll talk a bit about that later, because first we need to understand Japan's wine scene, and I need to let this breathe. Okay, I think I'm gonna have to call in reinforcements. Oh, yeah! Certainly smells like a red wine anyway. So there are 4 main areas producing wine in Japan. That's Hokkaido, Niigata, Nagano, and Yamanshi. Of course there are others too, but the most famous of them all is Yamanshi, and that's because it produces around 40% of all of Japan's wine. And I said that Japan is relatively new to the wine industry, but that really is just relative to other countries because Japan has about 100 years of winemaking under its belt. The first company to produce wine in Japan opened in 1877. But it took a while for wine to take off in Japan, and it wasn't really until around the first Tokyo Olympics and all that Western influence that people really started to drink wine often. But what about the Tsukuba Winery, right? It's not in any of the areas that I just mentioned, and it has a really hot and humid climate too, so why on earth would you want to open a winery?
オーナーがここの土地を手に入れて、ここで何をやろうかって想像したときに、これブドウ畑ができたら綺麗だなっていう。
綺麗だな。
はい。単純にそういうところから始まって、ここがワイン用ブドウが作りやすいとか、いいブドウができるとか、そういう土地ではないんですよ。
So it turns out that Tsukuba is not all that well suited to most types of grape growing. The higher temperatures of Tsukuba make the sugar content of the grapes go up and the acidity go down. And acidity is an important characteristic of wine that gives it that kind of clear and fresh taste. So to deal with that, the Tsukuba Winery has to use specific types of grape that are still going to produce a nice flavor even in those kind of conditions. The main types of grape that they use are Fuji no Yume and Hokkaido no Shizuku. Yep, those are both Japan-specific breeds. They have a few others, but let's stick to these for a moment. So both types of these grapes are a crossbreed of other grapes. So in the case of the Fuji no Yume, which is the red, then it's a cross between something called a Yamabudo, which is a crimson glory vine in English, and a European Merlot. So those grapes have a slightly thicker skin and they're more resilient to rain and higher temperatures. And the Hokkaido no Shizuku, which is a white grape, is a combination of that same crimson glory vine, but with a Riesling. These grapes retain their acidity even at higher temperatures, which is more important for the white wines. But they're also a bit more sensitive to the rain, so the Tsukuba Winery needs to take some precautions. Both these types of grapes are generally harvested around end of August, beginning of September kind of time, which is a little early in the grape world, but it is perfect for the Tsukuba Winery to avoid the typhoon season. Yes, typhoon season, you heard me correctly. It's not the rainy season, which is earlier in the summer. It is an entire season dedicated to typhoons. Dedicated. The typhoons come of their own accord, they're not invited. And as I'm filming this particular part, we're just starting the typhoon season and a bad one is on its way. And obviously typhoons don't mean good things for grapes, so it's better if they can have a breed that they can harvest before any kind of typhoon hits. They also grow a Merlot and a Marselan, which is something that I'd never heard of before, but they have to make sure that they choose all of these very carefully to go with the climate. And the main reason that they have to be so specific with what kind of grapes they choose to grow is because of the flavor that the different grapes produce in different climates. And the two main factors are the sugar levels and the acidity. In warmer climates, the longer exposure to the sun allows for more photosynthesis. That's the process that plants use to basically convert sunlight into energy in the form of sugar. So basically, more sun means more sugary grapes. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you end up with a sweet wine, because those sugars can be fermented away to create a drier and even more alcoholic wine. But the acid content does pretty much the opposite. There are two main types of acid in wine grapes, which is tartaric acid and malic acid, alongside some others. In hotter temperatures, then the acid starts to break down, particularly the malic acid. They maintain their acid levels if temperatures get cool enough at night, which is why places like Hokkaido are good for wine growing. But in Tsukuba, then the temperature doesn't really change. So that's why the winery is pretty restricted in what grapes they can use, because they need to choose grapes that will maintain both of those levels even in this climate. Malic acid tends to reach its peak just before the veraison stage, which is the stage where the grapes turn from these tiny little hard green balls into plump and juicy grapes of different colors. From that point on, then tartaric acid takes the lead. Overall, wines made in warmer climates tend to have a more fruity and full-bodied flavor. So think tropical fruits and berries as opposed to citrus fruits. But to taste good in the first place, you need to have been growing the grapes for 10 years. At that stage, the grape flavors come into their own and become viable for vinification. Basically just because the flavors have finally started to settle and have their own characteristics. And from then on, it's no easy ride. I mentioned that the white grapes, the Hokkuten no Shizuku, are more sensitive to the rain, so that's why they have these kind of plastic coverings above them. Up until the harvest season, then they check every day to make sure that there are no openings in the plastic letting the rain in, and to make sure that their grapes are nice and safe. They do this because the rain can cause so many problems. The rain facilitates the spread of disease, but it can also make the grapes blister and burst, and even dilute the flavor. The wind is also a factor because it might knock the grapes about, causing them to get little cuts, and then the water gets in through the cuts, and then mold comes to the party. No one invited you, mold, get out of here. But that's just the white grapes. The red grapes are much more resilient to the rain, so they don't need the covering. With all of the grapes, they also need to look out for bug infestations and diseases, and make sure that the grapes are growing in the right way, and all of this all throughout the year. Once it gets to the harvesting season, then the Tsukuba Winery volunteers make their rounds on these adorable little wheelie carts to pick the grapes. These are the best invention for harvesting, I swear. For the white grapes, it's a little bit more of an involved process because they have to cut off the bits that might have fallen ill due to the rain. But for the reds, it's much easier. And as you can see, the grapes are kind of separated into these two layers above and below. For the reds, if they can avoid the worst of the typhoon season, then they can harvest those second grapes above later in the season. But the white grapes that come later in the season just don't create a viable wine. Up until now, the red grapes have had it relatively easy, while the white grapes have been prone to issues. But when it comes to processing, that's where everything completely changes. Tsukuba Blanc is the white wine that is Tsukuba Winery's pride and joy. A previous vintage of this even won a gold medal at a national award known as the Sakura Awards. It has a floral, citrusy aroma with notes of white peach. And I know what you're thinking, if this is their pride and joy, why didn't I get that one to try? Well, I'm sorry, but I just prefer reds. I'm a red girl and no one can take that away from me. But to make that white wine, the Tsukuba Blanc, the process is fairly simple in comparison to this one. They take the freshly harvested grapes and remove the twigs and leaves in this funky spinning machine. Then they take the fruit and pop it into another machine where they press the juices out. Here, he's checking the sugar levels of the wine, aiming for around 20 grams per litre. They transfer those juices to tanks for fermentation. In the tanks, they let the juices settle and then they add yeast to start the fermentation process. After fermentation, then the wine is clarified and filtered before bottling. Obviously, that takes a lot of work and time, but not as much as for the reds. This is Tsukuba Rouge, their premium red that is part of their flagship trio. It's rich and full-bodied and has notes of brandy and chocolate. Also, I'm told, because I haven't actually had a sip of this yet, so I guess we'll see if that's actually the case when I try it in a little bit. So to make this, they first separate the grapes from the twigs and the leaves. But that's pretty much where the similarities end between the red and the white. Because from here, it's pretty complicated, so bear with me. They take those grapes and put them into a large tank for 2 to 3 days, where they let them ferment and also let gravity put pressure on them to extract some of their juices. So that juice is siphoned into a secondary tank. So basically they have some gravity pressed juice and now they're just trying to get more juice out of what's left over. But the tank is way too huge to just upend it and put it all into the press. So they have to take everything out of the tank and put it into another vessel. Then they use a forklift to shake everything out of that container and into the press. So now they put it at higher pressure to extract more juices in the press. So now we have two juices, a kind of gravity pressed juice and a machine pressed juice. Some places will keep those separate, but here they combine them, bringing together the sweeter gravity pressed juice and the more acidic machine pressed juice for a balanced flavor. So that combined juice goes through a kind of secondary fermentation where the malic acid is converted into malolactic acid. Because apparently malic acid is not very tasty, whereas malolactic acid has a smoother and more chocolatey flavor. It's then rested, clarified, and filtered before bottling. So why is it so much more complicated to create the red wine? Well, that's mainly because of its color. It's not just the fact that the grapes are red or white that makes them that color, it's actually how they're processed. To get their signature red color, then red grapes are fermented with their skin intact. This gives the juices a longer skin contact time. So when the juices are fermenting and bubbling away, then they start to extract that red color from the skins. Leaving them to ferment for a few days, it gives the wine a deeper color. And this process is called maceration. On the other hand, white grapes are pressed directly after harvesting with no fermentation period beforehand. This separates the skins from the juice immediately, resulting in that light color. I also mentioned that the Tsukuba Rouge is supposedly very different to any red that I've had before, and that's because of its lack of astringency. Astringency is the slightly bitter or acidic taste that, in the case of red wine, is largely due to the presence of tannins. You probably know tannins from the slightly bitter flavor you get in red wines, tea, and the skins of fruit. Tannins are naturally occurring in lots of different plants. This Tsukuba Rouge has a relatively low amount of tannins in comparison to a regular red. And that's because the grape itself doesn't have many tannins in the first place, so we end up with this less astringent red wine. And this has been staring at me this entire time, so now I can finally taste it and tell you if I can sense the lack of astringency and those brandy and chocolate notes. I am definitely not a wine buff, so I'm not sure how this is gonna go, but let's try it out. It just smells so good. It's not overpowering. It does have some kind of, not a bitterness, but it's acidic. But it's quite refreshing, it's quite light, it's not really deep and over the top. I'm not really sure about the chocolate part, maybe like a really, really dark chocolate. A bit of a blackcurrant taste, I would say. Very easy to drink though. It's a little dangerous, but it being so light and refreshing is quite different from the red wines that I've had. Normally they do feel heavier, they feel denser. It's more summery, it's lighter, and that's something that the Tsukuba Winery wants to highlight. They want to create something that goes with Japanese food, and Japanese food inherently is much milder and much lighter. Western food has a lot of wild game and overpowering flavors that go well with the astringency and heavy-handed reds. But this will go much better with the Japanese flavors, the sweet and salty that you get a lot. Buta shogeaki, like ginger pork. This has a Japanese characteristic to it, and that's great. So if you ever find yourself in Tsukuba, then you should definitely go to the Tsukuba Winery, maybe try out one of their wine tastings or go online and buy some of their wine if you're in Japan. So I'm very happy that I had this opportunity to go to the Tsukuba Winery, and I'd like to thank them for all of their help and all of the information that they've provided. And thank you so much for watching my video. I'll see you next time. Cheers.